presenter and guest is Steve Sullivan, who we're privileged to have. Steve has been advocating for victims for almost 20 years, having served as the former president of the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime and as the first federal ombudsman for victims of crime. He is currently the executive director of Ottawa Victim Services and a part-time professor at Algonquin College in the Victimology Graduate Certificate Program. Welcome, Steve, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thanks to the CCJC for inviting me. Given my background, you're probably wondering why I'm here talking about programs that are given in prisons for offenders, because I don't give programs for offenders who are in prison. But I do have some thoughts on how those programs can interact with victim services, but more importantly, how victims might perceive those programs. And I do actually feel a bit of a connection to some of those offenders you spoke with who learn a lot of things, which might surprise us. When I started out working in victim services, I worked a lot with a specific population of victims who experienced some of the most horrific stranger-based crimes, and you probably read about some of them that you can imagine. And they saw the justice system and victims' rights and services from a particular lens. And that was the lens that I started out with, and the lens that I saw the system and victims' experiences through. But it wasn't long till I began to meet and learn from other victims of crime who had maybe different experiences, maybe more common experiences, and realized that what I had perceived as what victims would want and victims need and want to see with the justice system maybe wasn't universal for everyone. Now that probably is simplistic for those who were more experienced in the victims movement than I was back then. But for me, it was quite eye-opening that there were victims of crime who had different needs, who have different perspectives, who needed different things from the system and from their governments, and victims who actually talked about healing. In my early days, in the groups that I worked with, nobody talked about healing. They talked about justice and the justice system and offenders being accountable and offenders being punished, but nobody talked about healing. And one of the things I learned, and I'm going to tell you a couple stories of amazing people who I learned them from, was we're talking here about offenders having empathy for victims in their situations. I learned there's an incredible capacity for victims to have empathy for their offenders. That was an eye-opening experience for me very early on, that the people who were harmed could actually look at those who had harmed them and sympathize and empathize with their own situations. And it wasn't always just about their own suffering and pain. One of the earliest experiences that I had, and the people that I talk publicly about or mention their names are people who have been public about their own experiences. One was Celine Lee, who was actually a woman from British Columbia, whose sister and her sister and mother were killed in an arson. Their home was set on fire. And Celine was quite young at the time. I think she was a teenager. And this obviously losing her mother had a real, not just the loss of her mother, but she took over the role of the mother almost in the family. She took care of her younger siblings. Had a real impact on her childhood, her teenage years growing up. And that led her to have a lot of resentment towards the person who had committed that crime, who had been convicted, I think, of manslaughter and given a fairly lengthy sentence. And Celine grew up with a lot of anger about what he had done. She had heard certain things from the police about what his motivation was. He was a skinhead, he was a Nazi sympathizer, all these different things. Celine, I think at one point, had written a letter to him in prison to basically just tear a strip off him. This is what you've done. And in BC, they have it was really one of the first programs, groundbreaking programs in Canada, which can bring offenders and victims to have a dialogue together. And they got involved, and there was letters back and forth, and Celine began to engage in a dialogue with this individual and learned a lot of things about him that in fact weren't true from what the system had told her, the police, the justice system had told her happened, really wasn't what had actually happened. And when I met Celine, she was giving a presentation, not unlike this, with the man who had killed her sister and her mother and her sister. And that was, I sat in the back of the room, probably like some of those offenders in the beginning, not believing what I was seeing. I mean, I'll be honest, it was completely different than what I had experienced before that. And she talked about her empathy for him and how she had seen him differently. But she went through her teenage years thinking that he had done this on purpose and he was a skinhead and he hated her culture and her family and had no empathy or sympathy for what he had done. And she realized that here was a guy sitting in prison every day beating the crap out of himself for what he'd done. And the fact that when she learned that he felt that way, so much remorse for her family, that had an impact on her. And that really changed her own perspective of him and how the system reacted. And I remember I've met Celine a number of times. She's talked about how she didn't, and I say this as someone from Victim Services, didn't always feel comfortable when she began the dialogue, engaging with Victim Services, because they didn't understand someone from that perspective. And she talks about the healing that came from that encounter with that. Another woman that I met, and I met Donna Cadman. I met Donna and her husband Chuck in 1995 in a little pub in Victoria, BC, about 2 o'clock in the morning. I had flown in for a conference and they were there. They were meeting with the Minister of Justice for BC the next day. And I'd never met them, I knew of them. Their son had been killed. Jesse is a 16-year-old boy who was killed by another teenager. Jesse was walking home one night with his buddy. Actually called his dad and said, hey, it was like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. Can you come pick us up? He wasn't far from home, had walked before. Chuck just said, well, you guys have done this. There was a couple of them with, a couple other guys with them. You can walk, it's nice out, no big deal. Jesse and his friends encountered another group of individuals who were causing trouble, words exchanged. Jesse was a rather unique kind of individual, much like his dad. Very, didn't look the same as everybody else, didn't dress the same as everybody else, stood out, very much an individual, which was a credit to Chuck and Donna for raising him that way. And these guys didn't like the way he dressed and didn't like the way he looked, and so there was an encounter, and a young man named Isaac stabbed Jesse in the back, and Jesse died. So Chuck and Donna began a lot of work around the Young Offenders Act at the time. They wanted stricter penalties for youth who commit serious violent offenses. But Chuck also did a lot of work with first-time young offenders. It wasn't as well known as his advocacy for tougher penalties, but he used to go into institutions and youth facilities and talk to these young people and try and dissuade them from continuing that kind of life. But I met them, and I'd never seen them before. For those of you who follow federal politics, you might know Chuck from his days in Parliament. Chuck, he's just a hippie. He's a long hair down to his back. It's all gray. I don't think I ever saw Chuck in a jeans and a jean t-shirt more than once, or a jean shirt. So met them, and wonderful people, but they had a very particular perspective on the justice system. And I recently reread Chuck's the biography on Chuck, and Chuck said he would never forgive what Isaac had done. Chuck eventually ran for the Reform Party, lost his nomination seat when it became the Conservative Party, but ran as an independent, was elected. Part of his platform was to get tough on young offenders. Chuck died a couple of years ago from cancer. Donna then ran in his seat in Surrey, and she won for one term. But clearly a kind of a tough on crime crowd. And a couple of years ago, and they had, some of you will know, corrections can provide information to victims about their offenders who are in prison. They get transferred, all those kinds of things. And fair to say, Donna and Chuck's perspective of the first portion of Isaac's sentence, it didn't appear that he was, in their mind, learning very much. He was being transferred to maximum. The behavior wasn't, from their perspective, conducive to someone who has learned much from what he had done. And so they sort of opposed his release. At one point he was up for a parole hearing, and as we heard, victims can provide impact statements to parole boards. And Donna had written one, I think her daughter Jody had written one as well. The parole hearing was canceled for whatever reason, but Isaac had read Jody's impact statement, and he had written to the program in BC that can link victims and offenders. And they approached Jody and said, we have a letter from Isaac, do you want it? And Jody's very much like her mom and dad, very curious, and she said yes. And I don't think she read it right away, but eventually she did, and she wrote back, and they began a dialogue, and Jody actually went to prison to see Isaac. That encounter was videotaped. And Donna actually watched it later at some point, or watched part of it. She said she couldn't finish it. So she began to write back and forth with Isaac. And to make a long story short, Isaac's out on parole, and Donna, at the last parole hearing, wrote in support of Isaac's parole. And one of the things that, when she went to meet Isaac in prison, I guess in their letters he had talked about he had never had a pet. He always wanted to have a puppy. Obviously she couldn't bring him a puppy in prison, but she brought him a stuffed dog and said, when you get out, I'm going to give you your first puppy. And what changed, I think, for Jody and for Donna is that Isaac clearly, through their impact statements, had began to empathize with what he had done. He began to understand the impact of what he had done. And he began to see and appreciate what they had taken from him. And Donna told him that he had taken her son, so she was now invested in his success. So that if he failed her, if he got out of parole and didn't succeed, then he would be taking away almost like taking Jesse away again. And I think that understanding of his ability to empathize and sympathize with what they had been through had them both turn a quarter. When they went to meet with him, I don't think either had any intention of uttering the word, anything about forgiveness, but they both did. And that I don't think would have happened if they didn't appreciate the steps he had taken and the growth that he had had in being more empathetic to their own situation. The final story I'll tell you is about another woman who I'm not sure how public has been about her encounter, so I won't mention her name. I met her actually very shortly after her son had been murdered. He was one of three men who had been murdered by a particular individual. And not surprisingly at that time, this individual pled guilty to 3 counts of murder, which is almost unheard of. Very angry, understandably. There were a lot of issues with corrections about him being transferred or not being noticed. So the anger grew, but I'm not sure it grew as much toward him as it did the system, which it's ironic that we have a system that encourages offenders to be accountable. Often the system itself is not accountable to victims when it screws up. That anger, I think, began to fester. And at some point, and she had always told me, even from very early on, that she wanted to talk to him at some point. But there would come a day when she was going to sit down across from him and tell him exactly what he'd taken from her. And she had talked about this different times. And so at some point she said, I think I'm ready now. I don't have any expectation that he's going to hear very much of what I say, but I need to go there and face him and tell him. And I have questions for him about what happened. And she did. And it didn't end like the Donna and Isaac story or the civilian and the individual in her case. There weren't hugs, there wasn't forgiveness, all those things. But she does talk about her own feelings, much less angry, much less stressed. I don't even know, he's going to be up for parole in a little while. I don't know what she'll do, but I really don't think she'll oppose it. I'm not saying she's going to be like Donna and go and give him a puppy, but I think any stress she might have had is probably gone. And they've continued this dialogue because she saw some growth in him and the beginnings, I think, at least from her perspective, that he is beginning to understand what he'd done and what he'd taken away from her. He was beginning to have empathy for her and for the other families. It's ironic to me that, because I have a colleague in the field who has written a number of times to corrections to advocate for and promote the funding of victim empathy programs in federal prisons. And the response that she has received is, well, there's really no evidence that it works. So we're not going to fund something that there's no evidence works, which to me is kind of ironic given the current state we're in and the value that this government places on evidence. So I find that to be a tough pill to swallow. But I can't come here and tell you about evidence from my perspective working with victims of crime about how they perceive things. But I will tell you, I think there is an expectation on behalf of most victims that when offenders are in prison, one of the things they will be learning about is the harm they've caused. Now, that doesn't guarantee people are going to learn about empathy or have empathy. But I think many people expect that one of the things offenders will understand when they come out of prison is the impact of the harm, or they've had that opportunity at least to learn those things. And when I look at other different but relatable programs, we have a program here in Ottawa called the New Directions Program. There are programs like it across the province called, you may have heard PAR programs, Partner Abuse Response. They're programs that work with men, largely men, although women as well, who've been through the system for domestic violence. So largely men who have been convicted of or pled guilty to abusing their partners and now have been directed by the courts to take this program. Used to be a 16-week program. Government cut it back to 12. They claim that 12 is just as good as 16, although I don't know one expert who would agree with them on that. But the program, I actually had the director of the program in my class last week, and although they don't have a week that says victim empathy, he told me that every week is based on the premise of empathy. It is about instilling empathy in these offenders. And the program has evidence of success. Now, success is sometimes difficult to measure when you're looking at offenders. If a guy doesn't beat up his wife when he gets out, but maybe does something else that's criminal, is that success? But there is evidence to suggest that there is success in these programs that are really based around the notion of empathy. But from a victim perspective, it's hard to draw parallels. But one of the things we know from evident research around victim impact statements is they rarely impact sentences, which is sometimes surprising to victims. When victims give an impact statement at a sentencing hearing, often the decision's already been made, the guy's pled guilty, Crown and defense have proposed a sentence, or they proposed one's 2 years, one's 4 years, and you're kind of sure the judge is going to come down to 3 years. The victim impact statements have little impact on what the judge says or does. But one of the things that means the most to victims who give impact statements is whether or not the judge acknowledges the statement and acknowledges their harm. Not that he acknowledges it by saying the sentence is going to be this, but just in when he's giving reasons for sentencing, if he or she acknowledges their statement, acknowledges their harm, that validation means something to the people who wrote them. That ability for the judge to display he understands what they've done. And to me, empathy is really understanding. We know from research that victims of sexual assault, we know victims of sexual assault really report, children or adults, just hardly ever report to police. When we look at the reasons why, it's really not about this, for most, about the system. It's not tough enough, it's all this, although there is fear about what the system can do to victims of sexual assault. It's really around, I don't want anyone to know about it. I blame myself. I did this. People are going to blame me. The police won't believe me. I was out. I didn't know him. All these things that victims put on themselves, and quite frankly, we as a society do as well. There is some research that says victims are less interested in the justice system, but they do want validation. They would like for him to come forward and say, in some forum, to say, I did something wrong and I harmed you. So it's not the punishment, it's the understanding and the empathy that an offender can show, an individual can show about what he or she has done.